So once we're done filtering this solution, if a precipitate does form, we are trying to get out all of the lead 2 chloride ions. Typically, we have to usually add enough salt that no more precipitate will be made. We have to precipitate out all of the lead ions before we go on and try to identify whether or not our next substance is present within the solution. Our next one should be calcium, because from a process of elimination, if we have eliminated all the lead ions, then we could use hydroxide ion to identify whether or not calcium is present in comparison to barium ions. Similar to the chloride situation, we want to use something that is fairly common, fairly safe. Now, I've stressed in class that the sodium hydroxide is a fairly dangerous substance, but it's fairly common. It's a household product that we've utilized in some drain cleaners and such. So this is fairly common, it's fairly inexpensive, and if we perform it well, it's fairly safe to use as well. So our situation is we're going to add sodium hydroxide to our solution. If a precipitate forms, our answer will be yes, then we could identify that most likely, if we're trying to filter out calcium, we would say that calcium is present. If it doesn't, if we don't form a precipitate after adding sodium hydroxide, then we can assume that there is no calcium ions present within that solution. We've completed our second box of our flow chart, in which we have asked the question, if sodium hydroxide is added to a solution after we've precipitated out all possible lead ions, we can identify whether or not calcium is present. If we create a precipitate with sodium hydroxide, then we can assume that calcium is present. However, if no precipitate is formed, calcium is not present. Just like the first box we filtered, we have to filter if we have a precipitate formed. Next, we're going to identify whether or not the barium ions are going to be present as well. Similarly, we're trying to create safety. We want to make sure that it's inexpensive, the substance that we're using, and it's fairly common. One substance that is fairly common in households is also the sodium carbonate. Another name for sodium carbonate, of course, is going to be washing soda. In this case, we're going to add sodium carbonate to identify whether or not there is barium ions present. We could have selected any of them. I chose sodium carbonate just because of my familiarity with it. Once again, we will create our box. Will a precipitate form? Yes or no. If a precipitate forms, then we can identify that barium is present. If no precipitate forms, then barium is not present within that solution. And I'll show you what this looks like in a second. So here is our completed third box to our flow chart.